Is modern science compatible with Christianity?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why? Go on.
I can expand. I think there's a shift happening right now, making it easier to bridge than before. I understand why, if someone was trying to be a Christian and a scientist in the 18th century, let's say, it would have been more difficult because science was pushing people towards materialism, towards the idea that ultimately, if you reduce everything down to the lowest constituents of matter, you're going to be able to explain everything. So you need like some particles that we'll discover, and you need laws, and you'll be able to just explain everything with that, and just physical laws ultimately. So maybe like chemistry is just physics and biology is just chemistry and so on. And like there were people who were actually many people who were working scientists at the time were also Christian, but you can see that like the richness of Christian metaphysics was eroding, and this was going to be like a slippery slope. There were some people in the intelligentsia who were leaving Christianity behind because it's hard to be a Christian who takes seriously entities that are not just the lowest layer of matter and be a scientist at the time when science seems to be pushing people towards that direction. But this has been breaking down, especially for the past century. It started slowly, but it's been kind of building up. We can talk about different sciences where this happened, but the point where maybe I can even just tell you a story where the shift became like a pleasant surprise for me. I did my master's in philosophy, where I heard philosophical arguments against materialism that I found very convincing, and I expected at the time that many scientists across the different sciences would still be hostile to philosophical options besides materialism. And this turned out not to be the case. When I spoke with John Vervaeke, I was attacking him like as if he was a materialist. I think first or second conversation I had with him, and he would defend in ways that surprised me, because it turned out to be a Neoplatonist. He would be very close to Plato and Aristotle and these kinds of people on how he sees reality, and not reducing everything down to matter, but rather seeing layers to reality. And what surprised me most was, not just that John, who is a very respected cognitive scientist, is not a materialist, but he told me that in cognitive science, this is fairly mainstream now. People don't try to reduce everything down to matter. And he says that this is also making its way in other sciences. It's also growing in biology. And you can even see people exploring non-reductive options in physics now, and also in chemistry. So all the layers, I think the layer of science right now where this is most obvious is probably in cognitive science, because like you just make a lot more progress if you don't try to reduce everything down to neurons or ultimately like particles. In cognitive science, you need to treat emergent systems as emergent systems that have a non-reductive existence at their layer, and then you can explain so much more stuff that people are just leaving materialism behind in cognitive science.
Maybe science in our original modern formulation became quite materialist. We talked about this last time, and that's very productive in some ways for science, because you start really zooming into atoms, electrons, and that helps you see actually the importance of some of the lower layers that we just didn't really have access to. But then maybe, and tell me more about this, were there mistakes, presumptions made about just exactly how important that is, and then you actually, the metaphysics of, okay, but kind of what kind of thing is reality, and even if there is importance at the lower layers, how does this all work, and we sort of get too myopic perhaps?
Yeah, myopia is a good way of seeing it. I think what happens was materialism was a kind of hypothesis that people made in the sciences. Okay, we'll just try to see if we can explain bigger stuff by smaller stuff that combines with some simple laws. And we were able to make a lot of progress for a long time in physics, and then in engineering, and also chemistry. So because of the successes of this, it was normal that we would become kind of myopic, and we would think that we'll just keep like building up with that program, and we're gonna explain everything, including the like human body and even the human mind at some point. But when this stopped working, then people have started exploring other options, like more ancient options. So people can better understand now why Aristotle and Plato were not reductionists and why their systems are useful. And then it's it's not an immediate way back to religion, but it's pretty quick. So like when you consider that there are more layers to reality than just the basic physical material layer, then you can start to talk about, for instance, entities that exist above humans. So groups of humans that are bound in some ways by higher patterns, like a city. Maybe a city is a kind of higher being. This is a way that the ancients would have considered things. Maybe also now the internet or Grok, or like you can consider like different internet entities as higher level beings that have an impact on us that we can't totally stop. Like we pay lots of money to Google or like those companies, and then they grow and then they have an impact on us. So these are kinds of angels, higher level beings. That's how people would have considered them previously. So you're already starting to kind of enter into a realm of higher beings that looks kind of like paganism. But also when you consider that there are more layers to reality and there's still coherence behind all of it, you can start to think about, okay, there's a ground to all of those forms. There's a ground of intelligibility that is what Plato and Aristotle would have called God. And then you can try to look at traditions that conceive of things this way. And you can end up having a pretty nice fit between modern science and ancient classical philosophy, or also religions that have used or built upon those metaphysical systems like Christianity. So that's why I think the bridge now is fairly easy between science and religion. It would have been a lot harder 40 or 50 years ago. And I think it was also pretty hard to make 200-300 years ago. Even if lots of people were still making that bridge, it was like on its way out.
Tell me more about having higher level entities like cities or the internet in our modern times be something that we consider a real entity. I suppose we can always think, I guess, intuitively, whether even if we're a materialist, a city is there and it's real, but why would it be different in your way of thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that a materialist would. The issue with a materialist is that they would consider all the higher level things as just like illusions on the lower layers. And really, if you want to explain something, you need to look at this lower layer. That's what a materialist would say. So, for instance, one place where this is breaking down is in artificial intelligence these days. Like people are always talking about LLMs and these kinds of things, and people talk about their emergent properties. So, like you build this big model, you train it on lots of data, and then there are properties that emerge. Like it can understand like this concept or that concept. It can like have language and so on. So this is something that emerges. And whenever you talk about emergence, it means that you consider the higher level that just appeared as not reducible to the lower layer. If you try to just explain things on the lower layer, you wouldn't get anywhere. So this is common now, but it's not a materialistic thing. So if you look at higher level entities, like let's say a social network, like if you consider X or Instagram or Facebook, like if you consider these things, if you're a materialist explicitly and you consider that, well, like social media, they don't really exist. Like they're kind of just illusions. If you really want to explain things, you need to look at individual people who are building up those networks. But the issue with this kind of thing is that you'll be blind to ways in which those higher level systems can do things that you wouldn't predict just based on the lower layer. So if you take seriously the fact that like Facebook has a mind of its own, it's seeking your attention. Let's say it's feeding you like sometimes good things, sometimes bad things, but it's just trying to get your attention. And when we give it attention, we give it money, like indirectly. If we give it attention, then Facebook can sell us ads, and then this gives money to Facebook, so Facebook can grow, it can hire people. So this higher level entity has a kind of will. It wants to grow pretty much. So it's going to take your attention, it's going to take people's money, and then it's going to grow. And if you're a materialist, like it might be hard to know how to defend yourself against that. Like you might have some abstract tips that don't really work. Like, okay, I'm going to force myself to not look at Facebook today, or I'm going to try to fast and so on. And these things are pretty ineffective. If you want to defend yourself against the higher level being, it's going to be more useful to ally yourself with another higher level being. So for instance, if you're spending lots of time on social media trying to, like, I don't know, the algorithm might be feeding you all kinds of different things, but like probably it's going to be exploiting your desire for social interactions in some way. And that means that if you go and build a real community with people around you, or if you join a real community with people around you, then this higher level being, this new community, this church, let's say, it could be like another thing, but this club or something, that will also have a mind of its own, will want to grow, is gonna like take your attention to grow. Like this thing is gonna protect you against Facebook, for instance. So like this is so Saint Paul talks about us not battling against like the rulers of this world, but rather principalities and powers, like higher level beings. So like if you want to do battle in this realm, what you do is you ally yourself to another higher level being. So this would be harder to do for a materialist, and it leads to poor outcomes. If you really if you're really grabbed by a higher level thing, then you're also going to need to join a higher level thing to battle it.
Yeah.
I give the example of Facebook, but it could be something different, like alcoholism or like whatever higher level pattern that many people participate in. This is something that like you need to deal with.
The higher level patterns like a Facebook, a city, the way you describe it, it does sound very organismic and self-organizing. There is a life to it, and sure, like Facebook is not made out of biology. In part, it's made out of us, and along with whatever computers, the internet, all the networks surrounding it. But then that whole could be considered an entity. But then I wonder, you mentioned angels and spirits, and that maybe this is kind of exactly what they're talking about: social structures, cities, these high level entities. Tell me a bit more about why we lost that view, and is that exactly what they meant? I'm then trying to struggle to understand what angels, spirits meant.
Yeah, I don't think that's all that they meant. I think like it actually, like Christian tradition is not fully clear on this, and like it's going to be a bit different in Islam too, or in Judaism. It's and Buddhism or Hinduism for that matter. So it's like these things are not fully clear. There's not that many doctrines that we're totally sure about, but that's because some of these things get really really high. Like actually the levels that are just above us, like cities and social networks and these kind of things, they're pretty close to us and they're easier to understand. But that's not just what people would classify as angels. So typically, for instance, anytime we talk about, let's say, a law of nature, any like invisible pattern that has an impact on us, like E equals MC squared. E equals MC squared is an invisible pattern that has an impact on matter, but it's hard to say what kind of angel that would be, because it's just so far from us. But I think that's true for all the invisible patterns that will have an impact on matter. So in a city is actually pretty easy to think about. So before I say more, like, is that helpful already?
That makes sense. Like the angel of E equals MC squared. It's interesting because I would think that a mathematical formula feels very inert and like it's just, but then maybe that's just our human conceptual mapping. Like we can write it down, and so then it feels very inert. But to understand precisely what it is and how that law interacts with everything else, I mean, maybe there actually is a kind of agency. I'm not sure, but interesting.
I mean, it's a special kind of agency. That's why it's hard for us to think about, because E equals MC, it's not eternal in the sense that it's not outside of time and space. Like E equals MC squared exists because it's like a fundamental way in which our material universe works, but presumably it could have been different. Like presumably time and space could have been completely different. There could have been no time and space at all. Like maybe only God exists and there's no like concrete material universe. So then there's no equals MC squared that exists. So, but still, like it seems that as far as we know, like these things are not set in stone, but as far as we know from physics, at least as far as I know the literature, the laws of physics have been constant since the Big Bang. So it's been a pretty long time and it's been very stable, and it applies like across like very, very large spans of time and space. So A equals MC squared is not eternal, but I mean, it's a pretty big pattern. And as you said, it's not like, it looks abstract when we describe it with formulae, but we use a formula because it's useful for us to like calculate certain things, but it's not like we know in physics what like the entities we're dealing with really are. So, I mean, that's true for everything in physics. Like if I tell you that an electron is like something with this mass and this charge, I just know that if I plug these values into these equations, I can predict these or these things, but I don't really know what an electron is. And that's true for everything in physics. Physics just describes the behaviors of things. So that's why it looks inert. That's because like physics as a science only tells us the behaviors of things. So it like everything in physics is going to look inert if you just think about it. But that doesn't mean that in itself, intrinsically, it is inert. Same thing with us, by the way. Like physicists could presumably describe us in physical terms using very complex equations, But like that wouldn't be me. Like if a physicist give me a very complex equation that describes me, they're just describing my behavior, arguably, but they're not describing me really. And I think it's the same for equals mc squared or electrons or anything that you can give a physical description of. And when you get to very, very high patterns, something like equals mc squared, it's hard for us to conceive of. And I think that's why like angels, or you can also talk about virtues, like virtues are also conceived as like, I mean, not always, it's tricky, but some people at least conceive of virtues as kinds of angels. But that's also hard to conceive of. Like, what is justice? Like, and the different kinds of justices that can like have instantiations in many, many different ways that also arguably are different angels, but they're very hard to think about for us. And I also think that's why, to come back to maybe the earlier point, like if you know that you have to deal with a certain higher level pattern that is far from our layer, like you're going to need allies. You're going to need other higher level patterns to help you because it's hard for us to think about.
Right. I mean, with a higher level pattern like justice, it doesn't feel like anything we can point at. Maybe we can embody it, we can see other people doing it, but we could see a completely new situation, but still see that virtue feels just very related to the scenario that you're in. And I want to pick up on how you said, so we would need to align ourselves with higher level entities if we like wanted to contend with other higher level entities, or even to employ for good things virtues, like say what
Yeah.
a right amount of justice. Because it's like, if you try and do it in an isolated fashion, like I'm gonna employ justice exactly how and when I want to, I'm gonna employ kindness when I want to. It's like, does that defeat the point of the virtue? Are we smart enough to be able to rationally calculate exactly how to, because we can get ourselves into cycles in our life of, maybe a priori we intended to be kind and virtuous in certain ways, but like you brought before, maybe alcohol addiction or any kind of addiction, you throw yourself into these patterns, and then you can't just, there's no magical switch where you have infinite willpower and now you don't need a drink, you don't need to use your phone. So you're always in the world interacting with these patterns, so you can't escape them.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's true. And so, I mean, and even coming back to the earlier report about like, why would that be a problem for materialists? Like, if you don't take seriously the patterns you participate in, it's going to be harder to fix your problems, and you might be blind to some things that are pretty obvious. So, like, especially it's funny if you read some of the main like philosophical thinkers of the Enlightenment period, or just like modernity. So if you read people like Descartes or Kant, they're really weird. Like you can tell that like there are aspects of reality that they're sort of blind to. The way that Descartes talks about his body, for instance, is like as a kind of meat suit. And like Descartes, Kant also says some things like this. Like the way he describes sexuality is really weird. Like it's kind of like a robot would describe it. So like these. Like this materialism, this tendency to try to reduce everything down to lower patterns, it can make you blind to the higher patterns you participate in, and you can fall into very bad cycles. Like for Kant and Descartes, like they still had like some measure of success like in what they were doing, but if you read them, it doesn't look like they were necessarily like flourishing as humans. It looks like they were blind to very, very important things.
That reminds me of a podcast I recently did with Josh Pauling, who co-wrote Are We All Cyborgs Now? This book on technology, and we talked about the dangers of technology. And we kind of, in order to properly appreciate what are the dangers of technology and how to confront it, we needed to define what a human actually was, and also what a human is supposed to be. Because otherwise you can kind of just, from the sounds of it, Descartes or Kant, these philosophers who, I guess there are many different ways to think of your body. I guess, you could be Descartes and just go like, am I my body? Why not? Let me just, go to a cupboard and start thinking about logic from the start, and then I'll get to truth. And I could see the merit of that. But, it's hard to, yeah, like, it's hard to know where to start if you have to try and start somewhere, but like with technology, if you start changing your body or you start changing the world without at first grasping what should the world be like, and again, like high level patterns of being an agency, then because there are also, I talked with Michael Hanby, a theologian, about how there are unintended consequences and side effects of, say, technology changing many things. DNA, you start messing with DNA, the very deep core of who we are, because you think, oh well, since it's a material thing, and hey, we know how to manipulate materials, maybe we should just manipulate DNA. Why not? Hey, we can get all these improvements, and it's like, fair enough. But these very deep, complex systems like human biology that spans across time, you don't know how it's going to play out. You should probably be careful messing with such patterns, but maybe you would do that if you just don't notice what actual patterns are embedded in the biology of the body.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny that we're talking about the body and technology too, because just this morning I saw, I haven't had the time to look at it in depth, but there seems to be a correlation between like mental illness slash depression and social media use, mainly for leftists. So like if you're conservative, you're actually better off like not using social media at all. But if you use it, it's like not that bad, and you plateau pretty fast. Like whether you use it, let's know, once a week or several times a day, it doesn't actually make that much of a difference. It's better not at all than just a little bit. But when you use it a little bit, it seems to plateau. But if you're on the left and you're more open to all kinds of different experimentations, changing different things, then it seems to be like a straight correlation. The more you use, the worse you're gonna feel. And it seemed to be like related to the fact that, okay, like you might be opening up yourself up to too many things that you're not ready to deal with. Like if you, like classically people on the right would have more participation in higher level beings that protect them, like church. But if you're on the left and you don't have that, then you might fall prey more easily to Facebook or Instagram or Twitter and all of these. So I haven't had the time to look at it in depth, but it seems to be one of the things that's happening.
That sounds plausible to me, right? That because you can always say with the internet, oh, I know there are these maybe disgusting, weird, whatever, new ideas I've never seen before on it, but them just on my computer. I'm in my living room. Who cares? I can put it down anytime I want. And again, that's partly true, but then partly it kind of depends what is pulling you away from it and like towards better things. Because yeah, if you have your family around more communities, then actually maybe it's not too bad. Like you have some bad habits on Twitter or whatever, but you can always put that down. But then yeah, I wouldn't want to say pin it down on leftists, but if I just think about my own experience with friends or something, yeah, like I feel bad because sometimes like I myself can even have criticisms of, say, too rigid structures in Christianity, and I like more explorative ideas and stuff. That's why I have something like this podcast. But then people go too much into it just on its own, exploring sort of that weird philosophy or what have you. Then there feels like no ground left. You need some ground to be able to then explore new things. So yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I think it's related to like participating in higher level patterns. Like you need like some things to guide you, to protect you from things you might fall prey to. Because we're pretty small. Like it's I mean, for instance, now we know there have been like documentaries and studies about the negative impacts of social media. But it's crazy how like so many people just fell into the trap. Like when it came out, people had no suspicion that this could have negative impacts on them or on their kids. Like in retrospect, we can see like why this would happen. It's pretty easy to construct a model like afterwards of what was happening, but like the people who were really protected from these things were typically people who were like part of much higher level beings, like a church, for instance. That's what would have protected you back in the day. So, I mean, as you said, I'm also like pretty open and I like to explore ideas. So there's a limit. I don't think like it's necessarily a good idea to just like anchor down and not change anything. But I do think that if you have no participation in a higher living being that has like stood the test of time and is positive for humans, like you're leaving yourself pretty exposed to higher level beings that will pop up and might take all your attention.
I wonder with John Vervaeke's The Meaning Crisis, which he kind of diagnoses as occurring before even digital technologies, but nevertheless concomitant with that, at the same time, there was a rise in psychedelics and more exploration of new ideas. And I wonder if you see them as related, that and even I guess even UFOs and people wanting to explain patterns that they see as like, oh, maybe it's a material thing like UFOs. There are literal physical aliens or in another dimension, but still there's some physical ground to that, even if we can't access it. All this to say, weird, more mysterious phenomena that people want to see. They want this meaning.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that there have always been meaning crises. Like they come from different directions. Sometimes it's like a war or like pestilence, or like there's many ways that this can happen. But you're right that there's been something happening in our culture, and I mean we can trace it back pretty far, like John does in his series. I think like if we go back just a few decades, a lot of it is materialism in our culture, like 20th century materialism, both philosophically and also like culturally. What people mean by materialism, like consuming things and only caring about material goods, those two things aren't related. Like if you only see lower layer patterns, like if in your best science you only see the lowest level stuff, then you're not going to be able to see seriously moral patterns and higher level goods like community and God. Then like you're much more likely in your culture to only care about like food and housing and distractions. And so it's like those two things are correlated. um and I think a lot of the meaning crisis in the West was due to this. I think this was accelerated by technology. Um, and I think Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, is really, really good at tracing this out. It's related to what we said earlier. Like, on the one hand, like if you don't take seriously religion or some higher level kind of wise entity that you can participate in, then you leave yourself exposed to traps that will pop up in the culture. So for men since the 70s, it's been porn and video games. They're parasitic on like men's desire to attract women, and also to be agentic, like to do things, to achieve things, to do dangerous things, to attract women. Like those two things are very related. But instead of taking risks in the real world to attract real women in the real world, men are now satisfying those like basic instincts that are positive instincts with porn and video games. So since the 70s, you can see an increase in mental illness and all kinds of markers of meaning crisis in men. For women, it's been like more recent. You can also see like that there's a climb, and it's again related to technology. I don't know if you read it, Mary Arrington's book, Feminism Against Progress, is pretty good at tracing like how like the place of women has shifted since the Industrial Revolution. Side story, we could go back, but I'm gonna like shift back again to Jonathan Haidt. Since social media happened in 2012, well, I mean, with smartphones too, this combination took women's desire to grow socially and to connect socially and put it out of the real world and into the social media world where it's not as rich. So what happened is both men and women went into like lots of them fell into technological traps, especially if they were not part of religious households or communities that would protect them against these things. They fell into those traps, and it's had a devastating effect on mental health and meaning crisis in young men and young women, especially. So, like this ties all of what we said again together. So there's like the participation in higher level entities that can protect you, like church. There's technology that pops up, and also the meaning crisis that like those two things are tied together in our case.
I like your diagnosis of the problems of technology as not just thinking abstractly, or maybe about people are wasting time on technology or whatever, but just even particularly, say, with men, there are these high level patterns of, and they're not in you in particular, but it's like the world calls you to, yes, take risks and do things. And so, like, perhaps there is a healthier use of video games or technology in some sense, if you were to be aware of these patterns. I don't know. And then, yeah, it's like for women, different with social media, their desire to be in connection with others. And I notice for a lot of women, it's like I myself is pretty able to just put my phone off and for 2 days and whatever. And then, but for women, they kind of need to be in contact with people. They're like actively seen as weird if they don't do it. And it's weird, right? Like then we try and say, okay, who is at fault then with these things that come in, right? And it's like, on one level, there's part of us that wants it, or in the sense that there are high level patterns where it is really nice and easy to fall into such patterns, and there's genuinely real goods, right? Like, it's not necessarily fake social media in terms of the connection. Like, there is a real connection with people. Like, it's intermediated with technology, but there are people there. But again, as you say, maybe it just takes time to appreciate what exactly are we looking at, right? And just a couple of decades is not enough to kind of fully understand what is going on.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult problem, and I like the fact that in Christianity, at least, like, you're always supposed to have this tension between, like, staying rooted in something old, something wise, not losing that thread, but also going out to the margins and bringing your, like, wise thread to those peripheries. So I think, like, with all of these innovations, it's possible to use them well, but you want to avoid both extremes. I think, like, if you just try to anchor down and not use them at all, you might actually be fine, but there's a bunch of people you could be helping that you won't be helping. Like, and first victims will probably be your kids if you have kids. So if you try, like, to completely shield your kids from all of these things, like, odds are that when they actually get exposed, like, at some point it's going to happen, then they'll just fall into the trap because they're not, like, ready for it. And besides your kids, there's all kinds of people you could probably be helping. There's all kinds of benefits you could be getting from these things that you wouldn't be getting. So, I mean, for instance, Jonathan Peugeot is doing all kinds of good on social media. I think Bishop Aaron, there's all kinds of people who are using those things well. So there's no need, I think, for religious people to just anchor down and, like, completely isolate yourself from that. I mean, some people could, but it's like, as a body, like, you want many people, I think, to go to, like, those new things and find ways to use them well. And on the other side of the spectrum, you don't want to just, like, go out there willy-nilly with no protection, like, via some thread of wisdom that you're getting from something. So and as I said, like, the correlation seems to be pretty obvious. And also, like, it's not just social media use that is correlated with depression, especially in leftists. Like, in general, like, it seems that if you're left-wing, if you're just open right now, like, you're a lot more likely to be sad, depressed, and all of these things than conservatives. It's also true for women and men. Like, women tend to be more open than men, and they're also more depressed than men these days. So it's like, all these things, I think, point us to the, like, pretty sensible hypothesis that if you just, like, go out there without a connection to something old, wise, and solid, you'll probably fall prey to some higher level patterns. So I think you really want to have both. And I know many people who use social media well, who use technology well, who use video games well. It's just that they have this ability to keep the tension between, like, they're connected to something old, something wise, and they're also willing to explore those new things. I think the devil is in the details. Like, you just have to do there's no, like, quick recipe, and we like quick recipes, but it's more of a virtue thing. I think, like, you have to learn to do it well by keeping that tension.
I want to go back to the start when we talked about moving away from materialism, how to think about higher level entities as genuinely existing. And you hinted at the relationship between lower levels, like materials, and high levels as pointing to God, a ground of intelligibility, why maybe patterns can coexist. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, I mean, we can go into there's all kinds of classical arguments that open up if you are not a materialist. So a classical one is when you notice that there exist genuine patterns, that there are forms that shape things around us. Like, we talked about higher level patterns, but it's true for lower level patterns too. Like, the E equals MC squared is a pretty high physical pattern, but you can take, like, an electron, like the pattern of an electron, or cells in biology. Like, all of these things are forms. They are irreducible, and they have an impact on the lower layer entities. And all of these forms are connected together in a great intelligible hierarchy. And for many church fathers, actually, this was sufficient for them to, like, go pretty straightforwardly to, of course, there's a God behind all of these forms, especially the fact that they're so harmoniously all joined together. There are other arguments, but I think it becomes just pretty intuitive. In the past, I mean, I've read some, let's say, proofs for God's existence and these kind of things. I think they're good. They make sense. But I find that I just, like, kind of put them behind as this layered view of reality with layers of forms just makes it kind of obvious that there's a ground of intelligibility behind all of these forms. So I think it just becomes pretty obvious. Does that work for you, or do you feel like you like to have specific arguments for God's existence?
No, in part it works. But it still makes me curious and hungry to understand more what we mean by a hierarchy of intelligibility. That there is this molding and fittedness between levels. That kind of rings true. But tell me more. Tell me why that points to God.
I guess there's two ways we can do it. One is more classical, and one is more symbolic. The symbolic one for me is to notice that behind all of these patterns, all of this hierarchy of forms that order creation and fit nicely together, all of these forms come from the Incarnation. Like, I see ultimately that the best theory to explain the structures of the world, to explain the forms of the world, is the Incarnation. So then I ultimately go to God through Christ in the Incarnation. So I think like C.S. Lewis's book, Miracles, is pretty good on this. I give an updated version of this in my book because Lewis was formulating his argument like for naturalists of his time, which were all materialists back then, or mostly materialists back then. But now naturalists aren't materialists. They're like almost Platonists and Aristotelians, even if they might not want to use that term. They're pretty much Aristotelians and Platonists. So the argument is easier to make. And there's many things we can say. But to give you just an example of something that I personally find very like appealing there, it's really hard to explain why humans have the ability for abstract thought if you don't have something like the Incarnation. Why is it that we can do mathematics, for instance? When we prove a theorem, we're manipulating entities that don't exist in space and time at all. Like the Pythagorean theorem, for instance, to take a classical example. This is something that like is true. When you see the proof, you see that it had to be true. There was no like possible world in which that wasn't true. Even if there had been no physical universe, no time and space, the theorem would still remain true because it's an abstract truth. So how is it that we humans with like bodies of flesh, with like neurons firing, how is it that we can think about these things? How is it that there's this bridge between eternal realities that exist outside of space and time and our bodies that exist in space and time? And I think the best reason I've heard about this is the Incarnation. It's because the world was made for God to become united with it. So God came down all the layers of reality in the story of the Incarnation, even going down to like the womb and even to death, and became like a man that brought like apostles and a church and ultimately all of creation in communion with God, who is behind all of those forms. So this is one thing I find elegant, but you can just accumulate like thing after thing that the Incarnation explains. I do some of that in my book. I also point to, I think Jonathan has been doing that on his channel too. He has hundreds of videos where what he does pretty much is there's a recipe. Is you look at patterns that exist in creation, in culture, and you explain them in the light of the pattern of the Incarnation. And this becomes a very powerful cumulative case for the story of the Incarnation as the fundamental truth of creation. Like the best theory for all of creation is actually that God became incarnate and went through this story.
I like in your book when you, and forgive me if I'm not doing justice to it, but when you bring in the Incarnation, it sometimes feels like you treat it as a scientific theory. Like we have this weird phenomena, like that really high mathematical truths, like E equals MC squared, can actually be brought down by humans, and we can see the connection between the world and these high level patterns. And so, even though the Incarnation, in a way, forgive me, is kind of weird and strange, there's a way in which, okay, but if we suppose it, just let's say it's true, then what does it help explain? And that's actually a necessary thing to do. Like because once you take that perspective, but you then see what it explains, I guess that's how science works. Like, even if
Yeah.
we have a weird theory, but if it explains a lot, it could be true.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly how I see it. I do see the incarnation as a like scientific theory that is the most successful one in my opinion, and it's the same for like weird scientific theories in general. The example I always give is Newton's theory of gravitation. People thought Newton was insane when he introduced it because it was talking about a force at a distance, and everyone was mechanist back then, thinking there was only pushing and pulling between like mechanical things. That's everything people considered true in science at the time. So when Newton talked about gravity, people thought he was insane, but he was able to explain things that people couldn't explain otherwise. And he wasn't making more mistakes than the people made before. Like, we know that he was still making some mistakes, and that's why we ended up with general relativity afterwards. But if your theory is not making more mistakes than the previous theories and explaining more things, then it's a better theory. So that's how I see the incarnation too. I see that the incarnation is able to explain tons of things. I just give you one example, but there's tons of them. So I think the incarnation can explain more things than any other theory I've seen. And I don't think it introduces mistakes that other theories don't make. So that's why I take it. And then the existence of God is just obvious because it's part of the theory.
We could talk about what the incarnation explains. I'm still struggling to understand the import of God becoming man and such an act, even why it would be relevant to say us going about trying to do science, map mathematical patterns onto the world. I the symbolic event, or almost the causation even of how Christ, God being man, would change reality or help us understand reality.
Yeah, I mean, another one, since you brought up science again, is the kind of metaphysics we have right now where we're not reductionist. This is something that also flows straight from the incarnation. I think that's why we have science, by the way, because if you look at ancient intellectual systems, they're typically all emanationist. So they have the opposite problem that materialists have. They consider that all that exists is the forms, or God, who is like the thing in which forms exist. Like, that's what Platonists considered. That's also arguably what Eastern philosophies considered. And then everything material was just like some kind of illusion. It's like a progressive levels of decay down from forms, and then you end up with the material world. So that meant that intellectuals, for the most part, in all of history before Christianity, didn't really care about the material world too much. They tried to escape it, mostly. And it wasn't like that interesting a thing to study because that's not where God and fundamental reality are. You just should try to escape it. So, because Christianity considers all of the levels to be real, not just forms, but also like how forms incarnate in matter, all of that is real in Christianity, it meant that it was worthwhile to study the lower level entities in Christianity. That's why science came out of Christian era. So people studied lower level entities and then they discovered things. And as we said earlier, people then fell into the trap of thinking that only lower level entities are ultimately real. And then they like fell into the opposite problems that the ancients had. They considered that all that exists is the lower level stuff, the matter. And emanationism was just like something ridiculous. And there's many people like in that period, if you see what they write of Plato and Aristotle, they obviously didn't understand. And I think to some extent, it's not even their fault. It's just that like they were surrounded by an entire culture where everything that was real was the lowest layer. So like it was just inconceivable to think of forms seriously. But I think Christianity is able to keep both of those extremes. Again, that's like we talked about keeping the tension earlier in a more cultural and embodied context. But I think Christianity is able to do this everywhere, keeping the tension. And that's why like it can help even you do science, because you can take all of the layers of the hierarchy seriously. Like atoms exist, of course, that's good. We can study them, but so do cells, and so do so do human beings, and so do societies too. And we can study all of those things at their layers and take them seriously. So that's another thing that Christianity gives you, and I think that's why we have science now. People don't always realize it, but I think that's where it comes from. So that's just another argument. We can talk about others though, if you're interested.
tell me if this is related, but I liked your work on miracles. Well, it's citing C.S. Lewis, but uh, understanding miracles as because we can talk about Christ helping explain the world, but then and miracles relate to how Christ is changing the world or points to how the world could be, should be. And so tell me more about what Christ does to almost maybe change or fulfill the structure
Yeah,
of reality.
change is true. I think it's again part of this pattern where Christianity keeps the tension, and there's this like you have both of these extremes where God comes down into creation and will even die in creation, and on that path you're gonna have like microcosms of creation. There's a bunch of Jesus' miracles that you can see as this. They're recapitulations of what happened before at the cosmic scale. So classic examples are the virgin birth. Virgin birth is just a small version of creation, of the Big Bang, you could say, of something coming out of nothing. So there's a lack of seed in Jesus' birth, but still, like life comes forth from nothing. So it's a microcosm of a normal pattern. You could talk about the multiplication of loaves and fishes, because this always happens. Like each year, loaves and fishes multiply. That's a normal pattern of reality at the yearly scale, but it happens very quickly when the Logos himself, when God is present. So there's some of those miracles that you can see, but there's another kind of miracle that is more of the ascent. When Jesus comes out of the tomb, that's where it's most obvious. But you can even see there's a preparation for this. There's a build-up in the ministry that Jesus did before the resurrection. So for instance, he resurrected Lazarus and a few other people, and it's not normal. Like this is not a normal pattern. It's normal that people heal themselves if they have time. So in some way, when Jesus was healing people, it's kind of normal. It's again doing in a small, condensed way what he always does. Like people always heal themselves slowly, and like doctors typically just help people heal themselves. So that's not that surprising. But reversing the course of death, reversing entropy, that's not normal. That's new. But it becomes even more obvious when Jesus is resurrected, and then the body that he has outside of the tomb is a new kind of body. He's able to go through walls, appear, disappear, have people recognize or not recognize him. He's able to. A good example is he was walking on water. When Jesus was walking on water, that's also an example of like that's not the normal pattern. Like we always dominate water in some way. Like there's water in our body, for instance, and we dominate it. But like having potential outside of you, having water outside of you that obeys your will like this is a new thing. That's part of the new resurrected body. So I think what you can see, there's a lot we can say, but to be short, you can see that in this movement of like emanation, top down, like forms come down into matter, and in this emergent motion of matter growing into higher level forms, you can see Jesus who's coming outside of matter and form altogether and crossing all those layers to like bring the old creation to a kind of death, you can say, and then having it resurrect with him. And the Christian hope is that there's not just Jesus who like comes back with a glorious body. Ultimately, that's what all creation will go through. All of creation will die and go through the resurrection.
Tell me more about that last bit about how Jesus's death and then resurrection point to the happening to us, but just the rest of creation. Why would that be? How would that? What would that look like? I remember was this someone that asked Jonathan Pajot just straight up, would consciousness survive after death? And maybe it's a weirdly worded question for Jonathan Pajot, and he just had to say yes. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, after let's say physical death, it's hard to think about. We have like because there's obviously something eternal in us. As I said earlier, the fact that we can do math, for instance, shows that okay, there's something that's just like not bound to time and space in us. So you can even see this in Aristotle. Like there must be something eternal in us that survives after the body dies, but it's obviously not the same way that like we exist now consciously. And there's interesting theology you can read on that. So like after death, we're not in time and space in the same way. That means that we don't think in time and space in the same way either. Like we kind of exist in God's eternity. in some way. I don't know, closer to math than we are to atoms, let's say. So it's hard to think about. But it's also not the goal for us to stay there. In Christianity, at least, the hope is that we will be reconnected to our bodies, but those bodies will come back to a higher level of existence, like Jesus out of the tomb. And I see it as in like normal progression, where like the goal of creation is for it to be for it to be united with God, and this happens layer by layer. Like initially, like at the Big Bang, there's just like physics, pretty much, and it takes a long time until you have chemistry, and then you have plants, which are a bit closer to God, and then you have animals, which are yet closer to God, then you have humans that are yet closer to God. But especially with the fall, we get further away, and then we will be reunited through Christ in the resurrection, and we will exist as a new kind of being. In the same way that like we're higher than plants, let's say, we will be higher than our current humanity. So I see it as a normal kind of continuum. I would be surprised if something like this like didn't happen.
Yeah.
And then like why is the goal of creation to be united with God? Again, I see this as a like fundamental part of the Incarnation. So as a fundamental thing that the Incarnation explains, and I wouldn't know how to explain otherwise. Like, why is it that the world exists? Like, why? I haven't really heard another theory, because if creation sort of just stands on its own, then it's not able to explain itself. Like, there's nothing. You end up resounding to like pretty like bad or boring theories. And I think like, okay, somehow the laws of physics are eternal, and like it just happens, and then that's it. And you're not able to explain a lot of things. There's other theories that. So what I said is more materialism. That's how like materialists would typically explain the existence of the world. It sort of just happens. Classically, what most intellectuals would do in non-Christian systems is like they would have a separate kind of problem. Like it's obvious for them that God exists, but the world becomes a kind of illusion that is almost impossible to explain. Like, why is it like if God is perfect, why would he bother creating anything? And especially if that world is just like some way in which forms decay, then like this makes no sense. So like intellectual systems besides Christianity, I find like tend to give no good solution. Neoplatonists did get a bit close, but I think especially Christian Neoplatonists like got the answer. And their answer is that it's the same love that you see in the Incarnation. It's because God wants us to be distinct from him and united with him, because that's what love is. If you love your child, for instance, you want your child to grow and be genuinely independent. You don't want to just like shelter them and have them like be kids always close to you. You want them to grow and be independent and be distinct from you, like materialists would think. Like we're independent from God. We don't need higher level forms and so on. So you kind of want that a little bit from creation and from your child. You want independence, because ultimately, if that independence matures, then it's going to turn into a grown, mature like person in the case of a child, or a grown creation in the case of God and the world. And then that independent being that has a will of its own can freely choose to love his parent, let's say, and that's when they truly become close to their parent. So if I'm a good parent and my kids want to become independent, and one day they realize that they really love me, then that's how they're really close to me. So they're distinct and close to me. And I think that's the same thing for the world. Like God wants the world to be distinct from him, to be independent, to have sort of its own will and intentions. But if the world is thankful to God for that, and then loves God, then the world is also united with God. It becomes like God's glory. It becomes God's reflection, like a child with his parent. So that's another thing that the Incarnation is able to explain. And like if you have that, it's also normal that something like the Incarnation would happen. Like maybe it didn't have to play out exactly the way that it did, especially with the fall. We think like it happened the way it did because of the fall, but something like this was bound to happen, that creation would come back to God in some way.
So much good stuff there. And with humans being brought up beyond their current ontological level of reality, would you say then that, say, plants or animals would then also be brought up, and not that then like they all become humans, but like well, then maybe that's even part of the question. Like, then what kind of thing does reality itself sort of change? Like, what becomes the center of reality? And and how should we think about everything?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot that's going to change. Where, I mean, to some extent, we already do bring animals and plants to a higher level of existence than they would have otherwise. Like dogs become like human-ish in some ways. Like they like they're not wolves. They get civilized and they can do all kinds of useful things. They're happy to be disciplined. There's something that happens in dogs that you can see. And I think it's tricky because I think it's often hard to see because we don't do this very well. So often what we do to animals is in a way bring them lower. Like we might turn animals into plants. Like if you have this huge, I don't know, industrial farm that is turning cows into plants, then we recognize that this isn't good. But it's also possible for us to do it well. And I do think that like in the new creation, we're going to shepherd creation correctly and bring it into higher levels of being.
When I talked with Symbolic World editor Cormac Jones, we discussed how when saints were around, even animals, they were different. Like the presence of a saint, more connected to godly patterns in a way, and they also had a way to perform miracles as well, I suppose. Saints, so perhaps they're in a way more connected to kinds of powers that 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 are possible in reality. But like to us, when we look at saints, they don't look as human, though they look more than human. Um, to be able to bring
Yeah,
up,
it's the new creation because they're
yeah,
connected to the new creation. I don't think it's necessarily true of all saints. Like God, I think wants saints to play different roles of the story of the incarnation. So there are saints that are gonna look like Jesus in Jerusalem when he was anonymous. I think most saints are probably gonna be like this. For 30 years, Jesus was anonymous. So for 30 years, it's probably gonna look normal. And then there's some saints who like are playing the part where they're doing Jesus' active ministry. They might be doing miracles. They might just be speaking truth to some people who don't want to hear it. And some people are also participating in the new creation and doing these unusual new things that come from the next world. Like you gave the example of saints who cause animals to be different around them.
hmm. I wonder how evolution plays into this. We Does evolution make sense from a Christian perspective? And we have this notion that evolution progresses as well. I'm just trying to think through whether it's heretical or whether it can be compatible.
Yeah, I mean, in at least the kinds of metaphysics that I hold, I do like evolution because I think it's again one other instance of God working through different layers to bring creation higher. And I find creation more elegant and beautiful if something like the, if something like evolution happened. I do see like a continuum from like physics to chemistry to biology, ultimately to sentient human beings, and then to the new creation. I see a straightforward continuum. So it would be weird to me um, if something like evolution didn't happen. There are other theories, but I don't find them as appealing. We can talk more about them. There's some that like might make sense in some ways, but I feel at least with like
Mm.
the theology and philosophy that I prefer, I tend to find things more elegant with evolution.
The thing is with evolution is that it doesn't necessarily require just a materialism. I talked with a evolutionary biologist Andreas Wagner, thinking about the mathematical structures in like genotype space, like doing experimental evolutionary biology and just going like, if you move from one protein to another, what is the structure like as you just go across all the different pathways of possible protein structures or whatever, and it's like the counterfactuals of what would it be like, and it's like it's not just the organisms that exist, but also what could be. But they're both constraining each other. I mean, not like anything could exist because you need also the actual forms to explore that space in reality. And like with humans or more complex biology, we have the ability to explore more complex space. So perhaps there is a back and forth and the way it could make sense. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard Brett Weinstein say something interesting about like the neo-Darwinian synthesis that was probably trying to bite off more than it could chew. Um, I think we have to be careful because there could be like other ways of articulating Darwinism. So Darwin's theory of evolution isn't itself tied down to like genes, for for instance. Like they weren't around. Like the theory was just that there emerge useful traits that will get selected and propagate. So when Watson and Crick discovered DNA, we for the first time had a concrete mechanism to explain how natural selection might happen. And it bore fruit for a while, but it does seem that in biology itself, many people are thinking that, okay, this isn't enough to explain what's happening. Because there's, like what you just said, there's too many things that don't look mathematically like they could work. If that's the only mechanism you add, if you only add random mutations of DNA that get selected, that it seems like there's too much space to explore for just that mechanism. But Brett Weinstein observed that that's not, like, you wouldn't expect evolution to just necessarily use this mechanism. You would expect evolution to find all the ways in which evolution can happen, all the mechanisms, and then make use of all of them as much as possible. Because, like, if you can evolve faster than other organisms, you're going to outcompete them. And that means that your way of evolving is now, like, also part of evolution for, like, more and more. So you should expect this to build up. So we should expect to find many more mechanisms for selection than just, like, genetic variations in DNA. But I haven't heard good examples of what this could be. So I just say this to be careful, because I think it's good that the neo-Darwinian synthesis is breaking down and people notice that there must be more to biology than just this mechanism. But I don't want to go too fast, because biologists could come up with something new in the next decades, and I think this would be interesting. But the way that I think we can see it, regardless of what mechanisms biologists hypothesize, is whenever you have a different life form, you have a new form there. Whenever you have, can be like the jump from chemistry to plant life, but could also be like something smaller, like how, like, this particular species of mammal evolves like this, like, new fur or something. It could be bigger or smaller. Changes always mean that there's a change at the level of the pattern of the form, like something irreducible at the level of the organism. So it's just normal if you have a layered metaphysics where you take forms seriously at all of those layers. It's not surprising that new forms will emerge for the first time, and then they will propagate. As I said earlier, this could go through different mechanisms. Like, for sure, could be random mutations in DNA, but I wouldn't be surprised if natural selection used all kinds of different selection mechanisms.
Right.
Is that helpful?
Yes. I mean, and even different selection mechanisms, I suppose you could even think about when you have humans, we have tools, we can shape our environment, and it's in a way like we then shape what gets selected when we change our environment, and so then even the environment is not neutral. And as you say, right, I mean, it's still a scientific question of trying to find mechanisms of how exactly evolution works, and we're still trying to understand exactly all the ways and parts DNA plays, but also times when DNA is maybe more irrelevant, and there are actually other structures in biology, like bioelectricity, which are actually doing things, and maybe you don't need to call on the lowest levels like DNA to encode and structure the levels for you. So, yeah. This has been really fun. I appreciate
Nice.
I appreciate your time. Yeah, I don't think there's anything too much more I want to ask. I mean, this is really helpful for me personally. I feel like I've learned a lot. You have a new book. Tell me about that, and anything else you want to say.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, it touches on many of the themes we discussed today. So the book is titled Post-Reductionist Christianity, A Weight of the Meaning Crisis. It's published by the Symbolic World Press, so by my friend Jonathan. It goes through, basically, I try to give an argument to people who, like, are facing a meaning crisis and find that it's tied with materialism, and they can't quite make the jump to something like Christianity or even just ancient metaphysics. And I think there is no good reason not to make those jumps now. Things would have been different a century ago, but I think now, if we were just able to share the changes in scientific ontology, you can see that, like, there's no good reason not to at least be a Platonist or an Aristotelian. And then there's also like not that great of a reason not to go all the way to Christianity, which I think refines and builds upon those ancient systems.
Mm, mm. Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack.